Let's find out if there is any real-world differences between a 32 gigabytes of memory inside the M1 Pro versus the M1 Max in a real-world use case scenario. This is Artist Right. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Thank you to all of you who have subscribed and watched many of my reviews videos on the M1 Pro, M1 Max, and the 16 versus 32 gigabytes in a real-world usage scenario. To those of you that are new to this channel, welcome, glad to have you here. This will be a longer video with a lot of thoughts and analysis comparing multiple machines, including the topic of this video, 32 gigabytes on the M1 Pro versus the M1 Max. So timestamp in the description below, you can skip to those and view the sections you want to view. If you don't want to hear my analysis, feel free to just keep clicking on those timestamps so you can just view the chart and really do the analysis yourself. And also, if you want to see the chart longer than the period that I have it on screen, feel free to pause this video at any time. All right, with that being said, a few of my subscribers have pointed out that you can configure the M1 Pro and the M1 Max with 32 gigabytes of memory. What is the difference? Am I going to see a difference in any type of real-world performance? So I decided to do a test and let's find out. Starting out with these two processors, the M1 Pro has a memory speed of around 200 gigabytes per second, while the Max has a speed of 400 gigabytes per second. So we really want to see how this is going to translate in real-world applications. And what this really comes down to for many of us is that, are you willing to spend anywhere between $200 to $500 more to get the M1 Max for just the memory speed? Is this a worthwhile investment? And hopefully by the time we get to the end, you'll have some answer for yourself. And I also have some thoughts about this as well. So I want to point out an Anandtech website, if you are familiar with them, is really great. They do a lot of in-depth processor reviews and they go much more in-depth than what I'm doing here. And pretty much what they have said so far is that the memory bandwidth, for example, on the M1 Max, when you're just really using the CPU performance, most of the time you're not really going to be saturating that 400 gigabytes per second unless you're really using the CPU, GPU, and the neural engine and everything else combined on the processor itself. So I mean, most of the time you really think about the tasks that we do. Sometimes it combines everything in, but it doesn't really saturate all of those things at the very same time. And from my conclusion from reading the very long article that they have, which is really extensive and I enjoy it, is the fact that pretty much there's not a lot of processes out there or program out there right now that can really saturate all these bandwidth at the moment. But I'll leave a link to the article in the description below as well so you can check it out for yourself. Let's move on to my test and reference system, and I'll be the first to say that this is not the most equal and comparable test, but these are all the machines I can get in right now because if I order one today, it will probably be early December, depending on the configuration before I get another machine in to do a test. So right now, this is going to be what works for the time being. So if we take a look at this, I'm comparing two machines. So the base 14-inch M1 Pro processor. So this is the super base one with 8-core CPU and 14-core GPU along with 32 gigabytes of memory and a 512 SSD. The other machine I have is a 16-inch M1 Max. This is the top out one, 10-core CPU, 32-core GPU, and 32 gigabytes memory along with a 1 terabyte SSD. So now if we take a look at the test system that I am going to add in results for all these other Intel machines too that I have, the Mac Pro, the 2019 MacBook Pro along with the two M1s, and we are also testing 4 M1 Pros and M1 Max machine. I mean, there's 2 M1 Pros and 2 M1 Max, and also at the bottom there, you will see that there is a list price for each of those machines if you go out and buy them today. So now you start to have an idea as to the performance and pricing ratio, which is important. So the one thing I want to point out about these things is that in my previous video, I may have called them processor, and I am fully aware that these are what we call system on a chip or SOC or SOC. So if I do refer to these as processors, I am fully aware that these are a system on a chip and they're not just a processor only, even though I may refer to it as such. One thing that I also want to mention is that once we have reached the 10-core CPU between the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, you're really looking at the same 10-core CPU. So on these 10 cores, 8 of them are the high performance and 2 of them are the efficiency cores. This is very similarly on the M1 Max. It's just that the M1 Max have double, in general, the graphic performance because it has more GPU on the system, or maybe like about 50% more if you go with the 24 core version. So that's kind of the comparison between the two, but once you have reached the plateau on the CPU or the top end of it, it is pretty much the same. And let's talk about SSD size, which is a big conversation that a lot of people have. And now I have one extra machine in, I'm able to run this test. And truth be told, this is what it comes down to with SSD. Choose a size that you are going to need, not today, not tomorrow, but into the future, and make sure that you have enough space on your system. Don't worry about the speed. Don't get the higher one because it has a higher speed. It won't make that big of a difference. And if you're talking about like memory swap, being able to do it faster because of that 1 GB per second speed, I mean, let me put it this way. Even on the M1 Pro, the memory swap inside the processor or the SoC itself is running at up to 200 GB per second. So we're talking about a gigabyte per second difference here on the SSD. It's not going to make too big of a difference. And if you're only getting the 512 gigabyte version of the SSD, I mean, 1 GB per second transfer speed increase is not going to make or break anything at all, just because it's going to take almost no amount of time to fill that SSD up. And as I mentioned before, in order for you to really saturate the bandwidth on these SSD, you need to be shooting CF Express Type B that can read at around 1700 megabytes per second. You need to download around 3 of these cards simultaneously to the system in order for you to even max out that performance. So I wouldn't worry too much about SSD speed, just get the size that you need. And now we have arrived at the real world benchmark, which is the reason why we are all here. Starting with the M1 Max, I want to point out that on all the M1 Max that I've tested so far, you can go in and choose between the low power, auto, and high power mode. In my testing, auto and high power shows almost no difference. It's only like a seconds in between a lot of times, and that comes down to like just really margin of error. So my recommendation is to set this to just auto, forget about it so you don't have to change it back to auto afterwards. The computer does a really great job allocating the resources to these processors. In the chart, when you see all these graphs coming up, you will see some of them are denoted with M1 Max HP. That means it is tested with high power, and the other ones will have A on there. That means it's tested in auto mode. One thing I want to mention right now is that majority of the photo apps I'm sharing with you right now are not optimized to run on these systems just yet. They're not optimized to run on these processors as much as they may be optimized to run on the M1 processes of the last year computers in general. So until the software company really release an update that can harness full advantage of these, what we're doing right now is really just throwing full power at these programs and just having it brute force it all the way through. So I think we're going to see much more improvement from many of these programs. This is what I'm trying to say here. Let's start out with Lightroom Classic, which is mostly CPU utilization with memory usage in some of the tasks. Remember the test system, again, 14-inch base model M1 Pro and also the top M1 Max. And both of these machines have 32 gigabytes of memory. And what we're trying to see here is ascertain whether there is a memory speed difference that we can observe in the real world or not. So let's take a look. Lightroom 1-to-1 preview, and as we can see there, pretty much they are within about a minute of each other. And this, what it really comes down to is the number of CPU core that are available in these systems. So on the 14-inch, there are 2 less CPU cores, so this performance realistically is about the same. Memory utilization doesn't really happen in this task at all. Comparing this with all the other M1 Pros and M1 Max machine, you can see that they are pretty much clustering all together. So we're not really seeing an advantage even if we add more RAM in the system in Lightroom Classic as of now. Here it is, a comparison between all the other computers in the lineup, so 2 other M1 machine and also the Intel computers, and you can see how it spreads out right there. Let's look at the export task on 1000 files. Again, remember that all these tests are done with huge files or a large quantity of files. At 1000 files right now, we're looking at maybe about a minute difference between these two. So memory doesn't really do a lot here. The extra 2 core does help, but I mean, you're really spending quite a bit more to get those extra 2 cores, and I might just actually go with the base model because, as I mentioned before in the 14-inch review, this is one of the most surprising results that I'm able to see out of the computer, and I think that represents still one of the best values. Lightroom Classic export, comparing this to all the other M1 Pros and M1 Max computer, you can see that the spread is pretty much the same. And when we compare this to the Intel machine, So far, right now, the 2019 Mac Pro is able to beat this out, but only by about 3 minutes or so, as you can see there, compared to all of the other M1 Pros and M1 Max machine. So here's my theory about this. I think that once Adobe upgrade Lightroom Classic and optimize it for these processors, we're going to see these time nudge even closer to the Mac Pro, if not beat it out. So once Adobe release an upgrade that optimizes, I'll do another video specifically on Lightroom Classic and we'll see what happens then. The other thing that I also want to point out here too is that when we look at these processors, we kind of have to look at the number of cores on these M1 Pro, M1 Max, and also the M1 computer a little bit differently. Because it has the high performance and high efficiency, you generally want to subtract 2 from the number that I have listed here. For example, I have 10 listed here. It's really just 8 high performance CPU and 2 efficiency cores. The efficiency core will help with image processing and all these tasks. However, they're not really meant to be like the workhorse of the machine. So that's just something to keep in the back of our mind as we're comparing these CPU cores in the system as well. And having a look at 1K export on battery, we can see that the M1 Pro and M1 Max pretty much cluster at around the same amount of time. The data that we're seeing here is that whether it's powered or on battery, they're exporting at about the same. And the Intel MacBook Pro is the one that takes the longest there. And if we take a look at the battery percentage left after doing all these export, you can see that on the 16-inch model, they all sit at around 91. However, the 14-inch model does drop down to 87, and that does make sense because the battery is smaller. And lastly, the Intel one dropped down to 51%. Granted, yes, the processor is more power hungry and the battery is a little bit older. However, even if I have a new battery, you may be hovering at around like 60% or so. I don't think the performance is going to improve that much more compared to these M1 Pro and M1 Max computer. So let's quickly talk about fan noise. What it really comes down to is just the physics of the whole thing. The 14-inch fan will run slightly louder than the 16-inch model counterpart, and that is because the fans are smaller, there's less cavity on inside, there's less heat dissipation, so obviously the fan has to spin up a little bit higher to dissipate the same amount of heat. Otherwise, between these two machines, the performance is very similar. I haven't observed any difference at all, and like I said, if you just get the 14-inch model, just know that the fan will just spin up a little bit more. However, when we compare this to the rest of Apple computer that I have for comparison right now, nothing comes even close to the loudness that I am serving on the 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pro from Intel, because the moment the exports start to hit like 10 files, the fans start to ramp up like crazy, while all the other machines, for the most part, remains relatively quiet. So hopefully that helps out with fan noise a little bit too. And Lightroom Classic HDR Merge, let's compare the time between the 32GB model, and they are exactly the same. Isn't that interesting? So we're not really seeing Lightroom utilizing these memory speed increase in any meaningful way at all. The only difference that we're seeing here is like a second apart, which to me, I would account this to human error, like how fast I can press the start stopwatch. Most of the time, I don't think we're seeing too much of a spread here. So for HDR Merge, these machines are more than capable, and here it is compared to the rest of the computer for my testing. Now comes to the Panorama Merge. And let's have a look at the result here. This is 14 Nikon DA10 file, 36 megapixel, combining this to create a 314 megapixel image. And I know some of you do these type of Panorama Merge, even if all of you don't do it. So if we take a look at the time difference, it's only like a second apart. Again, this accounts for probably like human error, how fast I can press the start stopwatch. So not that big of difference at all, as we're seeing here. Here is it comparing with the rest of the M1 lineup. So between the M1 Pro and M1 Max, we can see that there. What we're seeing in this task in general is that the moment we add more RAM into the system, like double this, we start to see a 50% increase in performance and 50% decrease in speed. So it takes half the time. Decrease the RAM by half and we gain 50% more time, and decrease it by a little bit further, we even gain more time into the test setup. So you can kind of see there how RAM benefit Panorama Merge. And here it is compared to the rest of the lineup, as you can see right now, with the MacBook Air M1, 8GB performing last because there is not that much memory in that system. All right, now let's have a look at Lightroom CC, which I think is the perfect candidate to run these tests because it is a more modern code, and these code generally targets the CPU and memory utilization together in combination. So let's have a look between the 32 gigabyte. Now we are starting to see a spread. So the spread here is around like 5 minutes or so, or close to 5 minutes. And my theory about this, even though these two machines have like less cores and everything, we're seeing the effect of the memory speed and also the extra 2-core CPU on the system. So on this test, we're seeing a memory speed difference, and it definitely does speed things up when the program is really utilizing it. Here it is how it spreads compared to all the other lineups. So we can see that on the M1 Max, between the 32 and the 64 gigabyte version, the performance is about the same. However, on the 32 gigabyte M1 Pro, we do have a longer time. My guess is that if we are running this on the 10-core CPU version of the M1 Pro, this would probably maybe drop down to around 19 minutes or so. And the difference that we're seeing right now comes down to the speed of the RAM inside the system. But another thing that I want to point out here is the CPU utilization chart between Lightroom Classic and Lightroom CC. And this is something that I really want to point out because it gets to the core of the things that are happening right now. The first two that you see circle in red right there, or square in red, is the peak for Lightroom Classic 1:1 preview and also Lightroom Classic 1K export. The one thing you'll note in Lightroom Classic 1K export is that this peak is generally at around 75% CPU utilization, which is not that much at all, compared to Lightroom CC, which this peak is sitting at around 90%. So this is telling us that the new processes inside Lightroom CC for export is really utilizing and pushing this system really hard, whereas on the Lightroom Classic, it's not really doing that just yet. You can observe this in all these cores that I'm showing you as well, where on Lightroom Classic, there's only really these two high-performance cores that are pushed hard. If you look at all the other ones, they're not really being pushed quite as hard compared to Lightroom CC that's below. Everything gets pushed hard, including the high-efficiency cores. And you can see that there is a big difference between these two. So once Adobe release an update to Lightroom Classic, I think we're going to see a big performance improvement coming from that program. All right, so now let's have a look at that export chart again, just to kind of see the comparison. And hopefully this gives you a better picture for what may come in future with Lightroom Classic. Let's move on to Capture One. And Capture One uses mostly CPU and GPU utilization. It is really lean on memory usage, and it manages the memory in the system very well. It doesn't really usually exceed, I would probably say, like 8 gigabytes or so in my observation and testing this. Comparing the time using the CPU power, the differences that we see between these two pretty much reflects the 2 less cores in the system on the 14-inch model. That's the reason why it takes a little bit longer. So RAM doesn't make any difference at all whatsoever right now. And remember, the program is not yet optimized. Comparing this with the rest of the M1 Pro, M1 Max, you can start to see the result. They're clustering at around the same level right there. And when we compare this to the rest of the machine, this is also another very interesting thing that we're looking at. So the number of CPU cores doesn't really show us much right now. It just shows a normal spread and probably about a regular progression that we're seeing there. Let's look at the export. This is where we're starting to see the GPU performance come into play and not the memory speed. So going from a 14 GPU to 32 GPU on the system, we're really seeing a time decrease by about a third, or 33% more efficient, just about 30% just or so. The thing is this, when Apple scales up these GPU, for example, from the 14 or 16 core to the 32, they just really add in 16 more cores by extending the die on the M1 Max. And what we're really supposed to see here is the performance increase by about 50%, but we're not seeing that. And this is telling us that Capture One doesn't really know how to go in and utilize all these extra cores to its fullest potential yet. And again, this is the same thing we're going to see with majority other apps that I'm going to show you, including to an extent Photoshop. You can see right now the time spread between the two. The only computer I don't have in the studio to run the test is the 24 GPU. If I have an opportunity, I am looking to probably get one into the studio and run the testing at some point. But that will probably be a few more weeks like down the road. So that is an estimate and is an average between the 32 and 16 GPU version. But you can see that the 32 core, if you're using Capture One, it does perform the best as of now, and will probably even perform the best in the future as well. One more thing that I want to point out is that even though these processes may have been optimized in a future version of Capture One to run on these M1 Pro and M1 Max, the slope that we're seeing here between the 32, 24, and 16 core GPU along with the 14 core GPU version are going to be the same. It's just that it will get shorter, that bar, but I think that the performance spread is going to be very similar to what you're seeing here. Here it is comparing it to the rest of the lineup, and the Mac Pro 2019 with the Radeon Pro Vega 2 32 gigabytes of high bandwidth memory still beats everything out, but if you really take a look at the difference between these two, it's only about 3 minutes. So that tells us that the 32 core GPU version non-optimized is already within a hair of this video card that costs as much as a 14-inch MacBook Pro, brand new. So you can kind of really see the difference there, that for the price of a 14-inch MacBook Pro, you can just get one video card that goes inside the Mac Pro. And this is really showing us the power and performance ratio and price point that Apple is able to do in these machines, which are absolutely fantastic. I've also added a Capture One battery test. This is the export, and this is a new test. It does not include the 32 gigabyte M1 Max, but because the spread is generally about the same, I just decided to skip it because this is something that I added in the last minute. We can see that the CPU spread is generally about the same still. Between the 16 and 14 core GPU, they are about performing pretty much within the margin of error each other, so not a big difference there. On the 32 core GPU version, we do see again about a third of a time improvement. This is something expected, but realistically this number should be around 50% improvement, not just around 30 to 33%. And lastly, if we look at the battery spread on the system after running these 1000 file export, on the 32 GPU version, we're sitting at 91. On the 16 GPU version, we're sitting at 89. And there's something to be argued here that you may want to just get a more powerful GPU, especially if you're using it, because there are more to be spread out. That means a task can finish much faster, therefore using slightly bit less energy, which I think results in that, 2 points higher percentage on the battery. So that's just something to think about. We tend to think that the M1 Max is the one that consumes more power. I mean, in my testing, M1 Pro and M1 Max consume just about the same power. And if you're using a CPU heavy task, it may just be best to add more cores into it so that it can finish the task faster. Therefore, it is more efficient by way of just having more. Something very interesting to think about there. And also the 14 GPU version on the base M1 Pro, that ends up at 87%. Again, smaller battery. This makes sense. But if you really look at the spread so far, they're pretty much within a hair of each other. Let's look at Photoshop benchmark. I am using Diglloyd Test. I'll leave a link to his website in the description below. And here's a little bit more from an excerpt from his website regarding all the tests that I'm doing and what the thought process behind all these tests are. These are tests, these are based on real world performances in some sense. If you use these large files, it makes sense. If you don't, that's perfectly fine. But I just want you to know that I'm running these tests not only just for me, but to some of you that use these large files, these tests are going to help. If this doesn't apply to you, that's perfectly okay, and I do have full respect for that. So let's look at the Photoshop speed test. I run many of these tests in both 70 and 90% RAM on the system. We can see so far that the M1 Max is showing just a slight spread here, but we're really talking about milliseconds, like 500 milliseconds difference. I mean, that's half a second. It's not really going to make or break anything. However, when we increase this to 90% usage, I think that having the fast memory definitely does help a little bit. But again, if you take a look at this, we're talking about 3 seconds apart or so. And this price difference can really account for anywhere between $200 to $500. I mean, the configuration that I have here has a price delta of $500. So just think about that for a second. Whether this 3 seconds working on all these tasks, when I'm running these tests around like 10 times and averaging all these numbers out, is really worth it to you. Here it is with all the other M1 Pros and M1 Max machine. You can see how the spread is there and comparing it with the other lineup that I have for my test system. Here is the Photoshop medium test, 15.7 gigabyte file. You can see that the interconnect speed for the memory is starting to play a role here. I think that part of the thing why we're seeing the speed decrease on here, or the fact that the 14-inch is taking longer, is because it also has 2 less CPU cores, because some of these tasks that are run on this test does require CPU processing. So that's something interesting. But the fact that this is pretty much repeating, so this is around 4 seconds longer. And again, this is around 3 seconds longer. We're not talking about minutes here. We're only talking about a few seconds. And if you don't really have the use for more GPU on your system, I don't really see that $200 to $500 being worth it for just only a few seconds of the performance increase that we're seeing here. And this is like a really, I would say, like fairly obscure test, meaning that majority of you won't be running into these situations. And if you are, you're probably going to get the M1 Max anyway, because you know you need that performance. Here is it with all the other machines in my test lineup. And let's take a look at Photoshop Huge. Again, we're seeing the performance difference here, but I definitely think that the 2-core less CPU does definitely slow down the 14-inch MacBook Pro. Even though it has about the same amount of memory, I still think that we're starting to now really push the boundaries for the memory speed inside these machines. But I mean, if you're working with 56GB file, yes, it does speed this up by around like 25 seconds or so, and it is worth it if you're working with these large files. But majority of us are not really working with these large files, and this spread might not, be worth it for the price that you're paying increasing to the M1 Max processor. Here it is comparing between the rest, and what it really comes down to, if you're working with an extremely huge file, giving it more memory definitely does help. So going with 64GB of memory on the system is going to be a big benefit, more so than just choosing between the M1 Max versus the M1 Pro at 32GB of memory. Here it is compared to the rest of the lineup. And this is already beating out the 2019 Mac Pro with 96GB of memory. So this is telling us that the memory interconnect speed is playing a role here. So we have less memory, but it can exchange file faster between the CPU, GPU, and everything, resulting in this marginal improvement in performance that beats out a machine that costs twice as much. So a lot of interesting happening here. Let's quickly look at Final Cut Pro. I just wanted to throw this in there. If you do an H.264 export, you can see that it is worth it if you are a video pro to get the M1 Max, because we are cutting the time in half. This is happening because of the double encoder decoder engine inside the M1 Max processor. And you will see that between the different memory setup, for example, 64 versus 32GB, it makes no difference whatsoever. Here it is comparing with the rest of the lineup, the computer. Here's H.265 HEVC export 8-bit. Again, time is going to cut down in half. And even if we do a 10-bit export, I think we're going to see a very similar time being cut down in half as well on the M1 Max versus the M1 Pro. Here it is compared to the other computer in the lineup. And lastly, ProRes 422 export. Again, the time didn't really get cut down quite in half here, but ProRes, if you have to assemble everything together, it does take quite a bit of processing power. If you render these clip already, I mean, the time really cuts down to like around 42 seconds or so based on the clip that I'm testing right now. But so far, if you haven't rendered those, these times are pretty much accurate. So if you're using Final Cut Pro, it doesn't really use that much memory. Most of the time, it uses like around 6GB. It's really lean program. It manages the memory very well. It's developed by Apple, so this makes perfect sense. So if you are a video pro, I would definitely choose the M1 Max, and in general, I would say 32GB of memory or gigabytes memory, it's going to be enough for what you need. I don't think you need more than that, but if you are a video pro, you probably know what you need and what you don't need. So 32GB of memory between the M1 Pro and M1 Max, is it worth it? Well, let's see. The main question we have to ask ourselves right now, is it worth it spending anywhere between $200 to $500 more to get these performance increase? And if you take a look at all the tests that I've done, it's not as if this is a clear winner in all categories in all the program. It really takes Photoshop, for instance, working with very huge files to see that performance gain. It really takes Lightroom CC exporting 1,000 files to see all those performance gain. And the gain, the delta between those two, I think is really small. It's only maybe a few minutes. So if you feel that those few minutes or those few seconds in your time is worth its price, then I would say definitely get the M1 Max. But here's the thing. I believe that you're going to be better off picking the best processor that is suited for your creative needs. So if you don't need 24-core GPU, just get the M1 Pro. You don't need the M1 Max for that. Having that gain doesn't really mean anything if you're not going to use it, because realistically, the M1 Max, you need to be able to saturate almost everything to really get close to that 400GB per second speed. And again, the reason why I'm doing these tests is to kind of show you and give you my analysis. Personally, I don't think it is a worthwhile investment to really gain that 200GB per second by spending that much more. But if you feel that you can justify that, then definitely get the M1 Max processor, and that's going to make a difference in what you do. So if we take a look at the 14-inch model, if we just start with the base one to get to the M1 Max, you're looking at $500 more. If we're talking about a spread between, let's say, the upgraded M1 Pro, the top M1 Pro versus the M1 Max, yes, it is still $200. But as I already mentioned in multiple of my reviews, this computer right here with the base SoC is a very capable performance machine, and I think represents one of the best values that you can get from Apple today. So I still say go with the base model, especially if you're a student, if you're starting out, if you have a budget constraint that you need to consider. It's not going to make that big a difference. Just upgrade to 32 gigabytes memory and you're going to be fine. If you're looking at a 16-inch model, you're looking at around a $200 price difference to go from the M1 Pro to the M1 Max. And as you can kind of see, unless you're really doing those tasks at least 8 hours a day, I don't think it really makes sense to jump up to these higher GPUs and also the higher memory bandwidth, because we're not going to see that much of a difference. And what it is, a few seconds, I mean, you know, unless you really need that. All right, a few more things I want to add here is I want to have a conversation about size, battery, thermal performance, because a lot of people are asking me, what do you think between the 14 and 16? Like, I want to get the 14, but the battery life is shorter. I mean, all of this, what it really comes down to is physics. 14-inch laptop, I mean, it's a smaller cavity, smaller volume in general. The battery inside are going to be smaller. The performance between these processors are going to be very similar to each other. However, yes, on the 14-inch, you may run into thermal throttling on the M1 Max processor because, well, the fan is smaller. There's less cavity for heat dissipation inside. All of these things make sense. But I think that when we look at all these things together, we tend to just look at this from a spec standpoint, and we need to separate ourselves from that for just a second and really think about what we need. If you live in a city where you're constantly using mass transit, you have a backpack strap on your back, having a computer that's 1.2 pounds lighter, or like almost half a kilogram lighter, it's definitely going to help your back in the long run, especially if you're walking around a lot and you don't have a car. If you have any physical constraint that prevents you from lifting heavy weight item, but you want the power, the 14-inch computer is going to be perfect for what you need. So what I will say is this, between the performance and the Pro and the Max, choose the processor that you need because they are about the same in battery consumption. Yes, there may be some differences, but it's not going to make or break anything. If you look at the timing right now, these batteries, even on the 14-inch model, last for 17 hours on an average use. I mean, this is not going in there and doing heavy image processing or anything like that, or just exporting files, but you start to get an idea that these laptops are going to be better than the Intel Mac from the yesteryears anyway. You're going to be okay. And I would just stop looking at all these granular details and getting the machine that is best suited for your needs. And now let's have a look at some of the creative areas and recommendation. For instance, if you're just using these computers to bring the image in Lightroom Classic, do some minor color correction and exporting them out, I think these first two columns are the perfect machine that you may want to consider for the 14 and 16-inch model. However, if you end up doing a little bit more composite, large files, doing panorama merge, and I think that these spreads are going to be better for you. So for the 14-inch, I have two options, the budget and the optimal, and the 16-inch, again, budget and optimal configuration. And if you will find out right now, on the optimal configuration, I have this listed here as 24-core GPU. So I don't think that if you're using Adobe app, if you're just primarily doing photography, you need anything more than 24-core GPU. And realistically, I said that you should pick 64 gigabytes of memory. I mean, you can really just go with 32 on these and just get a better GPU performance on it. But I mean, if you're really going to go that high, then I would probably just jump up to the 64 gigabytes of memory and just make sure that you have a machine that will last for quite a long time. If we take a look at Capture One and also for Video Pro, definitely go with the M1 Max processor because those GPU cores are definitely going to get used, or in case of the video, the double encoder decoder engine is definitely going to show a great benefit. So both 14 and 16, there is a budget and optimal. And again, the budget one is going to be the 24-core GPU version, whereas the optimal one is going to be the 32-core GPU version. As far as memory, based on my testing, 32 is going to do you just fine. If you feel that you work a lot in multitasking, you work with large files in Photoshop, you're going to send the files from Capture One into Photoshop, have two programs open at the same time, then 64 gigabyte memory may be better suited for your needs. When it comes to Video Pro, just from what I'm seeing so far, 24-core GPU works just fine, 32 gigabytes. I think that's going to be more than plenty for what many pros are going to be using this for, unless you're doing a lot of visual effects, you're doing a lot of After Effects or motion or something like that, where you need more raw performance out of it, then I might jump to the 32-core GPU version. So that's my thought on this whole creative endeavor in general. I think that we now have to really look at the creative craft that we do and how we are going to buy a machine that is best suited for our needs. There's no one size fit all when it comes to these machines. And I want to leave us with this thought. So there's specs and there's creation. We have to remember that at the end of the day, these are just tools to help us be creative, to help us create what we want to do. That we shouldn't be concerned or overly concerned about the spec between all these minutiae, for example, SSD speed, for example, performance on the M1 Max on the 14-inch computer, because as I mentioned before, if you want a smaller computer with a lot of power, you now have the opportunity to get that. And the 14-inch with the M1 Max is the perfect candidate for such a thing. So don't over concern yourself with all these granular details and just go out there and start creating, because at the end of the day, it's not so much the tools that matter. These are all capable tools. It's you, the creative, that are going to head out there and really make something amazing out of these tools that are available at your fingertips. So anyway, I hope that you find that helpful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell when new. And remember, do not retrust. So I thought I might do a little blooper here at the end. This is more of just my commentary. I heard some people commenting like, oh my God, the way how that guy's holding the iPad. I'm really just holding the iPad in my hand like this. There's no extra grip. There's no pop out or anything. So it just works for me. Maybe my hands are a little bit grippier because I'm presenting or something. But anyway, it does work. And yeah, I can hold the iPad around like this. Anyway, just thought you might want to find out about that. I appreciate the comments because it's just fun for me to read. Anyway, thank you.